didn't.
Amazing. And good evening to a lot of participants who have joined us this evening. This is a webinar taking a look at Bill 23 from the province, although I suspect that we're probably also going to get into, we're going to probably talk about a lot of different bills. Bill 109, Bill 39, the hits keep coming from Queen's Park. But my name is Jeff Leeper, and I'm here with Glenn Gower. Hey, Glenn. And so we intend to get into a Q&A session very, very quickly, just in terms of how the evening will roll out. And we haven't discussed this with the panelists yet either. But our intention is to introduce the panelists. Each of the panelists is going to take a minute or two just to explain why they think they're here with respect to their interest in Bill 23 and some of the types of questions that they are going to be able to address. And then we really just want to give a very, very high level overview of where Bill 23 is, how we got here, what it covers at the very highest level, and then hopefully within 10 or 15 minutes, we will have opened it up to a general question and answer. Once we've done the introduction, Steph is going to provide some housekeeping about how to participate, and we'll be off to the races. We'll go until roughly 9 o'clock or so. Oh, is my camera coming in off and on? Sorry, I'm just seeing the blue light. I'm going to switch my camera over. So bear with me just a moment. I apologize.
You're back.
Okay. So with that, I tell you what, let's, Steph, could you ask the panelists to introduce themselves and just maybe call on them one by one?
For sure. I'm just going to go in sort of the order I see on my screen right now. So,
sorry.
Ray.
And Steph works in my office. Steph is my assistant on all things planning. I'm sorry.
It's all good. So yeah, Ray, if you'd like to go first, then we'll
yeah,
keep going
thanks,
from
Steph.
there.
I'm Ray Sullivan. I'm the executive director of the Ottawa Community Land Trust, and I've been working supporting communities trying to build affordable housing for a couple of decades now. And look, there's things in this legislation that we need to acknowledge. Ottawa does need to grow. We need more people in Ottawa, and we need more housing supply to support both the people who are here and the people who we hope are coming. This legislation may have started out as about housing affordability, but at some point along the train, it turned into a Christmas wish list for private sector developers. And there are a bunch of key things in there that show us this is not just about housing affordability.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ray. Next, David, if you'd like to go. Oh, you're muted right now.
I'm David Fleming, and I'm the chair of the advocacy committee for Heritage Ottawa, and been dealing with heritage in the city for 22 years now. And the consequences of this bill on the Ontario Heritage Act, I think, have put heritage preservation back 30 years in our city. And we have been making great strides with various councils and built heritage subcommittees and volunteers who work in the heritage community or in communities that have heritage properties. And we were actually making a lot of progress. And I think that was reflected to a great extent in the official plan. Now it's just all a wreck. And I agree with Ray that, you know, they say that this is going to create more housing, and it's just creating more problems for more people. And I deal a lot with the consequences of developers, and I think that this is the developer's piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Christine, if you want to go next.
Sure. So my name is Christine McQuaig, and I am a planning consultant in Ottawa. And I'm basically here to answer questions about the planning implications of the bill, what it means in a practical sense, and what the effects of this and what we could expect. And also with me that I'm noticing are also under my name is Dana Edwards, if you want to wave, and Arjun Sewer from my office, if you want to wave as well. I'm a little bit sick, so in case I end up in a coughing fit, I'm going to turn it over to them to answer questions related to the bill. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Christine, and for the introductions to the others in your office as well. And next up, Sally, if you'd like to go.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sally McIntyre. I'm the General Manager with Mississippi Valley Conservation Authority. Conservation authorities are concerned on any number of levels, but the top three that I would speak to specifically right now is the total devolution of wetland protection in Ontario, which promises to have all sorts of consequences, both in terms of our ability to manage extreme events, be they floods or droughts, the impact, of course, that would have on the natural ecology, as well as from a First Nations perspective, the relationship between people and the landscape that affects all of us. The second point I would make is that the deregulation of certain types of development activities from permitting obligations poses a threat to both the owners of those assets. And those assets are not defined in the regulation, so we don't actually know what exactly will be exempt from the permits. But from a water resources management perspective, anything that's within a regulated area today is regulated for a reason. And largely it's because we want to protect people and property from hazards. And, they use the term minor. And from my perspective, nothing is minor in a flood event. Everything becomes a projectile because it's now floating and mobile. And so anything within a floodplain should be regulated without exemption. And then lastly, I would question the overreaching of the province in the relationship between conservation authorities and our major funders, which is our member municipalities. Our municipalities fund us to the tune of 60%, the province to the tune of 3%. And yet the analogy I like to use is it's like the province telling you can use Joe snow plowing to plow your street, but you can't use them for sand and salt. And that's what the province is doing. It's basically saying municipalities, you can use conservation authorities for hazard management advice, but don't talk to them about natural systems or pollution. So those are my three major concerns that I'm happy to discuss and then some this evening.
Awesome. Thank you, Sally. And Christy, if you'd like to go next.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Ross, and I'm a land use planning and environmental lawyer. When I'm not acting as a lawyer, I'm also a board member on the Ontario Bar Association's environmental law section, and they have done some comments on this piece of legislation as well. And I'm also a board member with the Ottawa-based not-for-profit EnviroSector, which is an organization committed to transitioning to a zero carbon future through practical climate action, with a particular focus on transportation and building sectors. So Bill 23 certainly impacts sort of all of those sort of elements of my professional and sort of volunteer life. In my legal work, I do a lot of work advising municipalities and First Nations on environmental planning matters. I also work with landowners, but a large part of my practice sort of deals with working with environmental NGOs and also community associations. So I just want to say that all the opinions that you're going to hear from me tonight are my own. They aren't those of my clients or any of the organizations I'm a part of. I hope to be able to help you with sort of some of the legal implications of Bill 23, as well as sort of any interpretation that comes up. I've a couple of areas of sort of, I guess, key concerns. I sort of agree wholeheartedly with what Ray opened with is, there is a desperate need for more housing in Ontario and Ottawa, and also particularly affordable housing in Ontario and Ottawa. I share some of the other concerns of some of our other panelists, though. My fear with the current drafting of Bill 23 is that it encourages urban expansion, greenfield development, and development on sort of previously protected areas, with not enough incentives for some of the missing middle housing that I think is desperately needed. I have some concerns with the limits placed on municipal oversight on matters relating to sustainable and green design. And I'm concerned that it sort of attempts to silence municipality site plan purview with respect to sort of green landscaping, tree planting, all of those sort of niceties that are really important for meeting climate change goals. I have some concerns with the limits to parkland dedication, and just the fact that it sort of is creating a regime where growth no longer pays for the growth that it creates, sort of by massive changes to sort of the development charge regime. And sort of on a more legalistic basis, there's been a reduction in access to planning process for environmental and community groups and the limiting of some appeals. And I just want to really quickly, in the last 2 days, like all things in land use planning and with municipal governance these days, there's a lot of changes. So there's been 2 major changes to Bill 23 that were sort of part of the second reading amendment process that I'd like to speak to now, just because I think we've got sort of a lot of pushback in the media and with a bunch of groups as well. So initially, Bill 23 prohibited all third-party appeals with respect to official plan amendments and zoning bylaw amendments. That's been changed moderately in the second reading iteration of the bill. So third-party appeals for OPAs and zoning bylaws will now be permitted, but still prohibited with respect to committee of adjustment decisions and plans of subdivisions. So that's one significant change. And then the second sort of significant change is municipalities are now allowed to consider sustainable design in the site plan process, and also bylaws under the Municipal Act provisions that provide for environmental building standards and green roofs. So those are sort of 2 recent changes that I'm happy to speak more about.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. I think that wraps it up for introductions. And just looking at our chat right now, we're sitting at about 160 people participating. We've actually got a few counselors in there as well. We've got Councillor Dudas and Councillor Carr. So we'd like to thank you guys for attending too, and everyone else in the chat. If it's all right by Councillor Gower and Jeff, I'll go into the housekeeping real quick, and then we can hop to it. I think that's a good yes. So just to go over everything super quickly, I realize this isn't perhaps the first time for some people to come to one of these meetings, and maybe it is. So right now we have the Q&A open to submit your questions. We'll be taking any and all questions. We'll be trying to get through as many as we can and sort of delegating them to all the panelists, and they will be able to answer if they feel they have something to offer to it. It'll be a bit loose. Otherwise, you'll probably find that the chat is closed, so you won't be able to chat with us or sort of among other people. It's sort of the webinar format. And you can only, we've seen a couple comments of people who cannot, show their screen or speak. So as a webinar, essentially attendees can only watch and submit comments. So what we'd ask is that you just make sure you use the Q&A function, and we'll be watching that as well. If there's any sort of technical problems or something, we can answer directly to you to help out. So I see there's some hands raised. So if you want to shoot a message off in the Q&A, if it's due to an issue, please feel free to do that. Otherwise, we'll be just moving into, I think Jeff and Councillor Gower had a few slides they want to show first, and just do a brief overview, I think, of kind of everything broadly that Bill 23 touches on. And then we're going to jump right to the Q&A. And all panelists can see your questions as well. So everyone who's in a square on the screen right now will be able to see your question, and we'll be reading them out loud nonetheless, just due to the fact that this is being recorded, so anyone can do it. But we'll avoid putting names just to keep it anonymous, should anyone like that. And I'm told that Councillor Plant is here as well. So hello, Councillor Plant. Thank you for joining as well. So I pass it off to Councillor Gower and Councillor Weaver.
Yeah, thank you, Steph. And thanks to all the panelists too. Jeff and I last week thought, who would we like to invite to answer questions? And we came up with a list and you all said yes. So thank you. And I'm also really happy to see so many people on the call today, over 150 people logged in, which is great. There's a ton of interest in this, and it's part of the purpose of why we put this on, is just to raise as much awareness for residents as possible. I just wanted to quickly just put a little bit of time frame around this and how we got to where we are tonight. So it was October 25th, the day after the municipal election, when the Ontario government introduced Bill 23. And as you've heard from the panelists, it is a a sweeping list of changes to how planning and development approvals work in the province of Ontario. It went through first, second readings at the province at Queen's Park that same week, so moving very, very quickly. And keep in mind, our new council was not sworn in until November 15th. And we have a council with nearly half of the members, including the mayor, who are new councillors. So every municipality in the province, I think, is in the same boat that we are as new councillors, trying to make heads and tails of what all these changes mean and be able to submit comments or feedback to the province in a meaningful way. Now, the same week that we were sworn in, the province also held 4 committee meetings where they accepted delegations from across the province. We asked as the City of Ottawa to make a presentation. We were denied. I understand AMO, which is the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, a really important organization that speaks on behalf of municipalities. They were also denied hearing at this committee meeting. Many organizations have submitted comments, and perhaps folks have read some of those online. On Monday, as Christy mentioned, there were a number of small amendments made to the legislation, and we're expecting any day now that that this will go to Queen's Park for a final approval and then implementation. So this is moving incredibly quickly at the start of a new term of council. Here in Ottawa, we also have the provincial approval of the official plan, which has made a number of changes to our official plan. So that may come up tonight. And then there's also all sorts of things going around with strong mayors and minority approvals. So there's a lot that's changing right now in terms of planning here in Ontario. And then if you even go back earlier this year, there was Bill 109, changes to planning. And for the past 3 or 4 years, just one thing after another, we keep seeing changes to how planning works. I think, Jeff, you have a very quick sort of a top issues with Bill 23.
Yeah, so if I may, I have 10 areas where I believe Bill 23 makes fundamental changes to the planning regime in Ottawa. And just, I know many people are probably joining this evening because they've heard about the implications on wetlands or on housing, but I think I have sort of a list of 10 items that I believe will be fundamentally changed by 23. The first of which is that exclusionary zoning seems to be eliminated. So we anticipate that the Bill 23 would eliminate single detached only zoning. And I'm not sure that there is a consensus about that yet, but I know that we will probably get into that through your questions as the evening goes on. The province is reducing the amount of development charges, parkland charges, community benefits charges that it can collect. This has really fundamental implications for how we pay for the infrastructure that supports growth. I know we'll get into it, I'm sure, later on this evening, but in Ontario, growth is supposed to pay for growth. When you have more people, you need more libraries, more fire stations, more sewer pipes, especially stormwater management is a big piece, roads, transit fleet, etc. And this bill affects all of those. The Cache-Neuve Parkland Fund is going to be more constrained. I believe that the bill proposes that 60% of Cache-Neuve of Parkland charges would have to be spent in a given year. That is going to pose some problems for the city if that moves forward. The province is removing the city's ability to enact bylaws that would protect existing rental stock and renters. So I'm looking forward to your questions about that topic, which I know several of our panelists are going to be able to address. The site plan process has been significantly constrained. This is the technical review of the exterior elements of developments. There are questions about whether or not Ottawa will be able to move ahead as fully as it would like with its high performance development standards, or as others may call it, a green building code. Christy, thank you very much for the reminder, or the nudge that the third-party appeals rules have been changed. It sounds like that proposal has been dialed back, but I know a number of community associations who are often engaged on infill issues will be very interested to hear that the right to appeal to LPAT on Committee of Adjustment decisions continues to be on the table. bill. A really problematic one, and one of the reasons we're glad David Fleming is here, properties on the Heritage Registry must be removed if no notice of an intent to designate them is issued within 2 years. My understanding is we have something like 4,000 properties in Ottawa that we've identified as being of potential historical interest, and we keep them on a registry so that if they become development plays, we have the opportunity to take a second look at those and determine whether or not there is an urgent need to designate those. We could never designate 4,000 properties within the next 2 years, so some fundamental implications there. And finally, and certainly not last, wetland conservation would be gutted since the province would remove context from the designation of wetlands. Forgive my language on that, Sally, but wetlands are going to be evaluated on a much more granular wetland on wetland basis and not part of larger systems, which I know our naturalist, or one of our naturalists at the city, Nick Stowe, has talked a lot about. And I wonder, for those who are on Twitter, Stephanie, whether you might just put Nick Stowe's Twitter account up there so people can search the great thread that he made public. So as I understand it, those are the biggest potential implications of Bill 23 as they change city planning in Ontario. And the reason that Glenn and I are hosting this evening is there are no stupid questions. If any of this sounds important, but you don't quite understand what it means, by all means, put your question in the chat. There's a real desire on both our parts this evening that this is a no stupid questions night. If you've read headlines and you're confused by them, please, by all means, put a question in the chat, which or in the question and answer box, and I believe Stephanie will start working our way through the questions that you've already posed. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff and Glenn. So we've already got a number of questions in the chat. So just to advise, we likely won't be going in perfect order, and we'll be picking them out to ensure everyone can get a chance to answer, and really prioritizing the questions that are the no stupid questions from everyone, but we'll be doing our best to get through them. So maybe just to start with a larger question, it's one of the first ones that came up. What elements of Bill 23 lend themselves to legal challenge in the courts, if anyone would like to take a stab at that?
Good question. I think everyone's looking at Christy because Christy
I
is
was
the
just gonna
practicing
say.
lawyer.
Yeah. So yes, I'd be happy to take that. So I think I just want to maybe, I don't know if this addresses your question directly, but I know that there was a lot of, when the sort of the full third party appeal prohibition was on the table, I know that there was a lot of scope and a lot of commentary from legal for the sort of forums that, you know, there were some significant constitutional issues with that. And that I mean, in my opinion, sort of taking all appeals off the table as was essentially the case. And by that, I mean, sort of any third party appeal. So that would be any citizen group, any environmental group, any, you know, individual property owner. But I mean, I think the development community was also a little flummoxed by that as well, because there was a prohibition on sort of any appeals of any sort of municipally led sort of amendment as well. So it was sort of, you know, appeals were constrained on a bunch of fronts. I know sort of the Ontario Bar Association's commentary, the municipal law section, which is primarily development lawyers, and I mean, not exclusively, but primarily, I think we can generalize and say that. Their two main comments were just sort of the removal of third-party appeals on sort of both the citizen perspective and then also the development side. Just, it really sort of tarnishes and totally takes apart why we have administrative tribunal, because what you do is you basically are, the idea of administrative law and a land planning tribunal that deals with specialist matters is that you have adjudicators who are very specialized, who are able to adjudicate and understand land use as a matter and understand environmental issues. So what would happen, the comment was, if you don't have these appeals, there's just going to be a lot of judicial reviews to the court, a lot of actions for, torts or, common law causes of action in the court system. And that's sort of much more expensive, much more time consuming, and you're having non-experts make this decision. So that was sort of one of the areas of commentary. And there's also the idea that, it's unconstitutional to do that. The change, however, that has happened is, I think it's slightly different than Jeff may have reported. So third-party appeals are now allowed for official plans and zoning bylaws, but not allowed for community adjustment decisions or plans of subdivision. So that's sort of the new thing. I think the other concern that sort of municipal lawyers have is there's been a total readjustment of the costs rules and sort of the implications of being involved in litigation. So the Ontario Land Tribunal Act was amended to allow that costs be awarded against the unsuccessful party. So basically the loser pays their legal fees, but then they pay the other legal fees. So if a third party were to appeal, that would be the municipality's legal fees possibly, and the developer's legal fees. Conversely, if a developer appeals municipal refusal, then they'd be on the hook for the municipality's legal fees. So that sort of is another controversy as well. I think now that the appeals structure has been changed, there's less of an argument on a constitutional law front. I think this sort of cost implication is problematic because, the whole idea of administrative tribunal is that you're supposed to be encouraging public participation. And I know that the purpose of that, I guess if we want to, legislators look at purposes and lawyers look at purposes. The purpose of that is we don't want there to be frivolous and unnecessary appeals that slow down the approvals process, that this is a wrench in the process. And that's, I think, a fairly cynical view of public participation. But there's a lot of ways that you can ensure that only valid good land use planning grounds come to a tribunal, and those changes haven't really been made. So I think that's one way of answering the question. And I think maybe the other way of answering the question is, how do we challenge this? How do you launch an appeal? I think there's a bunch of environmental cases that deal with sort of lack of notice, lack of ability to comment, public participation rules through a judicial review of this. So, anyone that is related and impacted by a decision can judicially review a decision of the government. So this, I think, could be ripe for such a judicial review, either by the Association of Municipalities. I don't necessarily see a municipality itself doing that. I look to you, Jeff and Glenn, but it's a possibility. Maybe an organization like EcoJustice, perhaps perhaps Ontario Nature. They've certainly judicially reviewed some decisions and some former recent provincial bills and MZOs, for instance, that sort of were passed without, suitable consultation, and that sort of offended some, provincial laws and provincial policy statements. So a judicial review would be a possibility.
Christy, is it fair to say that it's unlikely that, say municipalities or, and forgive me because I'm not expert in the basis, but conservation authorities are also established by provincial statute, I believe. So is it fair to say that, generally the body that is created by statute is unlikely to take something like this to a judicial appeal, and it would most likely be third parties?
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely fair. I sometimes a municipality will be involved sort of as like an intervener, sort of someone who could comment on it, for instance. Other governments often get involved in legislation that way, but absolutely, you are a creature of statute, and that would be, I've certainly never seen it. So I would see this as something coming from, a larger sort of non-governmental organization.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy and Jeff. Just jumping to another sort of broad question. So this is directed to Ray Sullivan specifically, but up in the air for everyone, of course. But what are the major provisions in Bill 23 that will affect the development of more affordable housing in Ottawa? Do you think we can get changes to those aspects?
There's a couple of things, and these to me are some of the indicators why this is not only about housing affordability, because some things actually work against housing affordability in this. One example, cities right now, especially in urban centers, part of the development charges they collect from new developments are development charges collected to create affordable housing. So the city of Ottawa collects a couple $1 million a year that it uses to fund programs to create nonprofit and more deeply affordable housing. The city of Toronto uses those development charges that it collects to fund an acquisition program that lets nonprofits buy existing rental market housing and turn them into nonprofit and co-op status. That ability is going to be wiped out under this bill. So there's a lot of money that's going toward creating modest and low income housing that won't be available anymore. People have talked a little bit about rental replacement bylaws. So restricting the ability of a municipality to protect existing renters when a property is going to be developed. So the kinds of arrangements that allow for someone to have their rent replaced in a new building or offsite somewhere else to protect their tenancy or to protect the affordability of their homes. But one of the biggest things is that most major municipalities in Ontario have been moving forward with inclusionary zoning. And in fact, the city of Ottawa was on track to have staff deliver a report in the first quarter of 2023 on a policy framework for inclusionary zoning in the city of Ottawa. And it was heading toward 99-year levels of affordability for, I should explain what inclusionary zoning is before I go on about this. Inclusionary zoning is a regime that would allow a municipality to require a developer to make some of the homes in a large new development affordable to modest income people. It would only be targeted around major transit stations, and it's an exchange for the value that they're getting. So we all know that around these major transit stations, people are going to be allowed to develop much more density and much more height than is currently within the zoning. And when you allow someone to develop greater height and greater density, you're increasing the value of the property that they own. So you're making it a more profitable development. And this would allow the cities to get something back in return, namely some proportion of modestly affordable homes in there. The city was looking for 10 to 20% of the homes in those developments to be affordable. And that was backed up by an economic analysis that showed that industry could support that around these transit stations. This bill reduces that to no more than 5% affordable housing. And when it comes to the levels of affordability, when it comes to ownership housing, the city was looking at homes affordable in the range of $350,000, for example. Under this legislation, it's 80% of the average sale of a home in the city of Ottawa. So the average home in the city of Ottawa is about $650,000 right now. 80% of that's 515. I can't do the math in my head. But what I did do this afternoon is I went and looked up a couple of condo buildings that are being built right on the LRT line. So these are the kind of buildings that inclusionary zoning would apply to. And I looked up their price list. And already, without any inclusionary zoning requirements, you can buy a 640 square foot one-bedroom apartment for $520,000. You can buy a 510 square foot studio apartment for $450,000. Why does this matter? This is what the market's doing already. This isn't asking for any stretch. This isn't asking for any level of deeper affordability than the market is already producing. So they've effectively gutted the ability of municipalities to do inclusionary zoning because they've set the requirements at, well, status quo. And that's the kind of thing that we're going to get. So there's a bunch of things in there that are problematic. I could go on, but the fundamental premise is that all of these savings in reduced development charges, reduced timelines, the reduced exposure to potential appeals at the LPAT, the Land Use Planning Board, whatever it's called. People can correct me. That those are cost savings to a developer. The presumption is that those cost savings are going to be passed on to buyers and renters. They're not, because the cost is not what determines the price of the housing. The market determines the price of the housing. We've seen more rental housing built in the past 6 years in Ottawa than in the 25 years previous to that. Were rents going down over that period? No. So it's not such a simplistic equation of supply and demand as this legislation would assume.
Sorry, I just wanted to leave it open there. Thank you so much, Ray, for the response. And if anyone else would like to chime in, obviously, feel free. We're playing it a bit loose in that sense. Sally.
Could I just
Okay.
make a comment on heritage conservation? One of the things in designating properties, years ago when you designated a property, it was usually for its architectural merit. Now we look more at the cultural and associative history of the property. And I think, we've been evolving in our designations. And I think that what's happening with this bill is it's going to prevent that by having an arbitrary increase in the threshold for designations. Now we need one part of the one criteria of the regulation 906 to designate a building, and now we're going to want two, and that's going to prevent a lot of the more imaginative designations that reflect a very different society than existed when the Ontario Heritage Act and the regulation were formed 50 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And Sally, I see your hands up as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add that when we talk about the objective of this legislation, which is affordable housing, it's either rental or you're buying it. And when we're talking about the rental market, there's all sorts of governance around rental housing. And when we're talking about acquiring land and buying it, it's not just what you put out to, the buying price, as Ray was indicating, which is market driven, but the ability of you to continue to live there based upon affordable taxes. And so when you start to undermine the regime that is providing for growth paying for growth, you're undermining a municipality's ability to pay for those services that you assumed you were buying when you bought that house. And it really undermines the financial sustainability of communities. And freeing up land that is wetlands, wetlands are not inexpensive to develop. They require a lot of heavy engineering to deal with the water that is inherently there and the type of soils and vegetation you're dealing with. And when you remove that holding capacity that natural habitat provides, you have to replace it somewhere, somehow. And that comes at a cost as well. And when you are not able to replace that asset with the same, and that natural asset with the same capacity that it has inherently, then you are running the risk of the impacts of extreme events like floods and drought. And those have a cost as well. So it's a very short-sighted approach to take away the development charges that help a municipality to sustain the kind of communities that all of us want to live in, and to freeing up the development of lands, which will only cost us more, both in the short term because of the hard infrastructure you have to build, and in the longer term because you cannot replace 100-acre wetland with that same capacity it has to hold water during extreme wet weather events and to provide that nice slow release during the dry months of the year. It is a system that runs off natural processes that, as smart as we Homo sapiens are, we have not yet figured out how to replicate or to do so as cost effectively as Mother Nature has provided to us. So I just wanted to add those comments.
Thanks so much, Sally. we're seeing a number of questions on sort of the removal possibly of R1 zoning and exclusionary zoning. So I'm going to pick one of those, knowing that there's kind of been a number of questions to that effect. So we have a question that says, with the portion of the bill that addresses allowing multi-unit homes in any building, is there any clear direction as to how this will get implemented into Ottawa's R1 zoning? Will it effectively require the city to remove R1 zoning, or just add a subsection allowance for multi-unit buildings exclusionary zoning? And feel free to dive into R1 exclusionary zoning more broadly. Whoever would like to go first.
I'll start off that discussion, and just understanding that I'm from the private sector, so I don't actually work for the city. So how, you know, everything gets implemented is obviously ultimately up to the city, but I expect it would work similar to how secondary dwelling units are currently permitted. So right now we do have the R1 zoning, it permits single detached dwellings, but there is a section that specifically deals with secondary dwelling units, which is allowing as of right a second unit on a property that permits a single detached dwelling. It appears through Bill 23 that in addition to a secondary dwelling unit, a third unit would also be permitted on that property, whether or not that third unit is within the single detached dwelling or whether it's in an accessory structure on that same lot. How this would ultimately be amended in the zoning bylaw itself, that is not something I can particularly answer, but I expect it might be in the similar way that secondary dwelling units were addressed in the zoning bylaw. So Christy, I don't know if you have any additional comments on that, or if Jeff or Glenn do, but that would be sort of my expectation, is that it would be similar to how secondary dwelling units are addressed currently.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well, is just in that, and like I believe I read somewhere as well that there could be 2 units in like the existing dwelling and then that third accessory. And then, I mean, obviously one could also take a different stance of sort of doing a redevelopment on the lot and having sort of, you know, 3 separate units, you know, one on one lot. So, I mean, that could work as well. I think something I've noticed just generally with Bill 23 is there's sort of, you know, quite vague concepts that are undefined, with the understanding that a lot of this work will be done at the municipal level and also through regulations. And I think sort of, I guess, as the lawyer on this, I think the next maybe related question I might be projecting is, you know, is there any appeal of this? So very specifically, there's like some pretty clear language that there's no appeal, additional residential unit policies. So
that's correct. That's what I read as well.
Exactly. So that very specifically said that one cannot appeal if you add a second residential unit in a detached house, semi-detached house, or row house. One cannot appeal if a third residential unit is added in a detached house, semi-detached, or row house. Or once again, if you have sort of an additional standalone, sort of like more like a coach house kind of type thing, which is already frankly permitted in the Ottawa zoning bylaw as well. So no appeals with respect to any of that.
Yeah. And on the matter of appeals, I know you had raised how things had changed, that zoning bylaw amendments, official plan amendments were still going to allow appeals, but that committee of adjustment decisions would not be appealable. I want to note that there is in the transition clauses for that component, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of how this is going to work is that it is retroactive for the appeals that were currently put in. If they don't have a date for hearing on the merits, that they are going to be dismissed.
Correct. Yeah.
So there is a bit of, you know, backdating for even when this bill takes effect. Sorry, my voice is absolutely terrible right now, but anyway, there is some sort of retroactive application of the no third-party appeals on the matter of committee of adjustment decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for raising that. And the way it sort of works is if you have a hearing date set, so not a CMC or case management conference, and you know, not sort of like, you know, settlement discussions, it has to be a firm hearing. But if your firm hearing has been set, that is permitted to by October the 25th, the date that it was, you know, received first reading, then that appeal is permitted to proceed. It's just anything past the introduction of the bill that would not be permitted with respect to committee of adjustments. So yes, thank you.
I'd be interested to hear from maybe Christine or Christy or anyone else. we've talked a lot over the past few years and through the official plan process. We've used the phrase eliminating R1 and eliminating exclusionary zoning. But I sense a bit of hesitation in defining what Bill 23 has done as eliminating R1 or eliminating exclusionary zoning. What's the difference? Or there's a bit of nuance there. Like this isn't quite doing that eliminating R1 that many advocates have been asking for in the province, is it?
Christine, do you want to take a stab, or do you want me to lead this off?
I mean, from a practical perspective, to me, it's just a perception thing. If you're eliminating R1, but does that, if you're allowing duplexes, it's the same thing more or less as having a single detached and a secondary dwelling unit. I know Building Code Services views them slightly different in terms of the percentage of the unit, but functionally on the lot, 2 units is 2 units. So whether you're taking away the official R1 or simply adding an additional section in the bylaw that allows a 3rd unit and a 2nd unit, it's more or less the same thing. So I think it's more of a perception, or in terms of how you want the bylaw to function and be laid out, and in terms of being easy to read and in its effect. So that's kind of my take on it, but Christy, feel free to expand on that.
Yeah, no, I sort of agree. I agree with that. I think that was maybe a political choice not to phrase this as, we're eliminating R1. In that I think that's not necessarily popular with some voters who would support Mr. Ford, but I mean essentially, you are as a right, 3 units are permitted on every lot, so one could view that as R3 everywhere, just from a zoning perspective, or one could view it as you could still retain technically your R1 zoning, but just have accessory use permissions layered on top of that as an overlay. But I think, as Christine has suggested, the how you're experiencing this on the ground is it's the same.
Yeah. Well, because R1 is, if you think about it in the city of Ottawa, secondary dwelling units are allowed everywhere. So R1 is already not exclusively R1 in that sense, if we think about it that way, right? Like most people who have a secondary dwelling unit, it's 2 units, right? Regardless of the percentage of whatever, it's usually just 2 units. So.
I think one of the questions that I'm getting from residents is once Bill 23 passes, will somebody be able to demolish and build a triplex anywhere in Ottawa? And then on some of the larger lots in some of the R1 areas, would they then be able to, depending on what the zoning is, sever and build 2 triplexes? And I'm not sure that anyone's given me a definitive answer on that. I see a number of comments in the Q&A section discussing, why is that bad? And I just want to make sure that folks here understand that there are a lot of really strong opinions being expressed on a number of aspects of Bill 23 this evening that certainly the panelists we've chosen this evening, consider to be real negatives. The elimination of exclusionary zoning, or the elimination of R1, or the modification or the minimum unit count is in a somewhat different category, in that I don't think very many people on this call are necessarily opposed to those changes, but they are important changes to the planning regime, and so we wanted to make sure we were exploring those. So does anyone have an answer? If I have a big 20-meter lot in an R1 zone, am I going to be able to demolish a single, sever, and build 2 triplexes?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say likely. I think that would be, a logical implication to what we're seeing in terms of the wording of the sections. Obviously, I could be incorrect with that, but I think that's largely what we would see as an implication of that.
The subdivision of those lots, the lots themselves would have to meet the provisions for the zone that they're in that permits a single detached dwelling unit. And then that also is consideration, when there's an accessory structure, because the bill talks about allowing a unit as an accessory structure on the lot. And so there's going to be, the city's allowed to have provisions relating to what that accessory structure looks like. So, or not looks like necessarily, but where it's sited on the lot and the size of it.
And building on that, there would probably might be a need if those provisions aren't met, if the lot's not large enough, for this obviously to go to a committee of adjustment procedure, a consent would need to be sought, minor variances might need to be sought. So there would still be that process. Yet that would be a process between the applicant and the committee of adjustment, and then possibly between the applicant and the tribunal, with really no sort of room for, obviously the city would have sort of an advisory role, but no really room for sort of any, citizen, input or opposition. And I think, I guess the thing that we might want to note is a lot of commentators are saying, well, that's nice that we're allowing 3 units in, on these lots. Some are saying, I've read, well, why aren't we allowing 4 or 6? So, I mean, there's sort of, and then, so I think there's views on all sides of this, all the sides of this point.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of momentum around removing R1 zoning across North America. So this is not necessarily out of step with what's going on elsewhere in the continent.
As a complete sidebar on this, when we're talking about adding secondary dwelling units and third dwelling units onto properties, I think one of the considerations that we have to look at, that's not really something that, can be resolved in this discussion at all, but we want more affordable units. We want more units in general. Obviously, these ones would be rental units, which, when you go ... you're going to end up with more landlord tenant situations. And I think right now there's a lot of, I'm sure everyone's been reading the news, but there's a lot of situations about how ineffective our tribunal is right now on the rental and landlord situations. So I feel like that's going to have to be significantly resolved if we're going to increase the amount of rentable units and therefore landlord tenant situations in Ottawa.
And I'd point out as well that newly created rental units are not subject to rent control. And that's an important measure to consider, at least to protect existing tenants from arbitrary rent increases from their landlord.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I'll go back and grab what I can from the chat. Maybe to put a very environmental question out there, and it's directed to both Christy and Sally, but to everyone as well. Is there a role for our federal government to assist municipalities or conservation authorities in opposition to these unilateral changes? For example, there are federal lands and waterways which will be clearly impacted. What to do?
I can start by just saying it would be lovely if the federal government decided to engage on this. I don't necessarily see them doing that, but where I do think there is an opportunity is, as I mentioned earlier off the top, the whole relationship between two public entities that are publicly funded, to constrain them from entering into a willing, open relationship to do business with each other. And the province basically telling municipalities who they can and cannot contract with to obtain advice. Interestingly, the way the legislation is structured, it constrains conservation authorities from providing certain types of advice to municipalities. Of course, the corollary to that is they are preventing municipalities from soliciting that advice from conservation authorities, and to do so in an affordable manner. I don't know what legislation this might fall under in terms of, does it contravene some sort of basic principle of ability of two entities to do business with each other, especially when it is in the public interest to do so. And there appears to be absolutely no rationale behind this. So that would be a question I would put perhaps to Christy.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the, there are many things that are concerning to me on an environmental, putting my environmental hat on, about this legislation. Not the least being the promise that, the provincial policy statement is either going to be entirely rewritten and or totally dismantled, which is, I think, one of the strongest tools for wetland preservation right now. I think it's
Christy,
one of the very few positives.
I'm really sorry. What is the provincial policy statement?
Yes. Okay. Sorry. So the provincial policy statement is one of like the pillars of land use planning, in that you have your Planning Act, which is, I think, probably the primary pillar. And there's a bunch of provincial interests in those, including, ecological protection and things of that nature. And then a step down from that is this provincial policy statement, which basically says all of the official plans that are passed in the province and all of consequently the zoning bylaws, any sort of land use planning decision made by a municipality or made by a tribunal must be consistent with the provincial policy statement. So it's a pretty powerful piece of legislation in that all decisions must comply with it. And it has provisions about wetland preservation that are, most of the provincial policy statement is sort of suggestive, I would say, but the provisions with respect to wetlands are thou shalt not develop in a provincially significant wetland. And then there's sort of setback requirements for, thou shalt not adversely impact, a wetland or a wetland complex. So that's sort of at provincial level, the sort of the strongest protection for wetlands. I've been reading that is either going to be amended and or dismantled and or changed in a fundamental way. Anything that's not a provincially significant wetland, I know conservation authorities are being asked by this legislation to suggest, which lands might be appropriate for development. And I think, as Sally has mentioned, huge implications for the flooding, climate change mitigation, like just like huge avenues, frankly, for municipal liability. In my mind, I mean, that's not what I'm most concerned about. I'm more concerned about the ecosystem, but also, allowing the development of these lands and then having, perpetual flooding. I mean, that's just it's not good planning. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Arguably, it's not necessary because, I think one of the things that I was struck by the city and Don Herwire's report is that according to the city's studies and even the Ministry of Finance's projections, that there was plenty of land available for development. So why are we looking to natural heritage lands and wetlands and sensitive lands that are, as Sally mentioned, very expensive to develop? Why are we looking at those as potential lands? But I think we're straying far away from the question, which was, what role is there for the federal government? And then Sally's question to me of what role is there. Basically, the Bill 23 sort of contains some provisions that the city, as Sally said, can't ask the Conservation Authority, which is the expert in this area, about, how is this development going to impact, watershed? How is it going to impact water flow? How is it going to impact, the Rideau River, for instance? Being very, very high level here. And I think the city this is sort of one of the other things that's being downloaded to the city, like with sort of growth not supporting growth anymore, infrastructure, bike lanes, the LRT, transit, parkland, all of these things that we buy with development charges, we being the city, that can't occur any longer. Same goes for the lack of ability to ask your conservation authority what are the impacts of this. That means that there's two options. The city will be forced to do that analysis themselves. And I know that, the city hasn't structured itself that way because it's been relying on its conservation authority partners, which makes a lot of sense. Or you ask, the developer to provide that analysis, but then the city, of course, then has to have a capacity to either review it themselves or do a third-party review. So once again, who's paying for these things? So I don't know if I want to belabor this point. I think the one thing I did notice this week, which was a bit of a bright star, was the announcement with the federal government on 270 affordable housing units in various parts of Ottawa. That was something that all levels of government were certainly participating in. And that type of action can occur if all three levels of government cooperate and have a unified vision. However, this bill, I think, as Ray has noted and Sally has noted, is sort of saying one thing but doing the opposite.
Sally, if you want to add on to.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something Christy mentioned, and that is the options available to municipalities given this basic downloading. Within the city of Ottawa, we're fairly fortunate. There's a large tax base. There's a very healthy economy. It's definitely taken its hit, as everybody has in recent years, and it faces financial challenges. But as a watershed authority, we have 11 municipalities within our watershed, and the other 10 are upstream. And they're not as big as the city of Ottawa. They're not as financially stable. They are not as well staffed, and they do not have expertise in-house to deliver the type of services that they look to the conservation authorities to provide. They do not have the capacity to buy those services under Bill 23. So you have to think about that our watershed, our jurisdiction is over 4,000 square kilometers. And most of that is upstream of the city of Ottawa. So those 10 municipalities are going to be making decisions around wetlands, around development, without the resources they need to make well-informed decisions.
Thank you, Sally. And Ray.
I just wanted to build off what Christy had mentioned, which was the announcement of a number of affordable rental housing projects with support from all three orders of government, which is fantastic to see and is definitely a part of the solution. If you look closely at those developments, though, a bunch of them were nonprofit developers and fantastic organizations. One of them was a private market developer, developing under a low interest loan program from the federal government, where the federal government tried to build in some requirement for affordability, and they missed the mark because their targets were actually above actual market rent in their requirement. But at least they tried. They failed, hopefully, and they did correct it, and that program now will require some modest level of affordability. The province hasn't tried to do that. So, the province has reduced development charges associated with rental housing, and more rental housing is good. We need lots more rental housing. I was talking with a private market developer earlier today who was saying between development charges and GST, that's about 20% of the cost of the project. It's probably exaggerating a little bit, but he was saying, he could reduce the rent by $400 or $500 if he didn't have to include those kinds of charges. So the provincial government's going to reduce those development charges, but are they asking in return a reduction in the rent? They're not. They're not even trying. And these are the kinds of exchanges that have to come with it. Some of these things will help speed up development, will lower the cost of development. Where is the provincial government asking for direct affordability in return?
Thank you, Ray, for those excellent points. Maybe to dovetail a bit on that, we've been getting a lot of questions as well on sort of the impact of rental housing by Bill 23 and protections of it. So just to choose one question out of many on that front, we have one that asks, what will be the impact of changes to inclusionary zoning to reduce targets, both in unit count and time commitment, but also maybe more broadly, if anyone wants to touch on the impact on rental housing, inclusionary zoning, that sort of thing. I put it to everyone.
I'm going to comment just briefly, but then I want to hear what other people have to say. Under the old environment, municipalities were required to come up with economic studies about what the development industry could support, what was allowable, what wouldn't harm or reduce the prospects of development around these major transit stations if there was inclusionary zoning. And each municipality was doing that toward developing their policy. The province has gutted that arbitrarily. I haven't seen their economic studies that say that only 5% carve out is justifiable, or that these very modest levels of affordability that are pretty close to what the market delivers already are all that can be supported. So from my perspective, the prospect of inclusionary zoning delivering some modestly affordable housing is dead.
I was going to say kind of the same thing. I know when we went through our preliminary debate at planning committee, I guess it was planning and CPSC back in the spring, there was some sentiment from some of our council colleagues that would it be even worth doing this? Like the cost and the administration, would it even make sense to go forward with with a inclusionary zoning regime. Now, I think there is, but now with these new restrictions from the province, it becomes even more difficult to make that, call it a business case for the city to move forward. We were looking as a municipality, in fact, the mayor wrote to the premier and to the Minister of Housing to increase the number of areas eligible for inclusionary zoning. So going beyond just near transit stations, a larger footprint in terms of what would be eligible for inclusionary zoning. And of course, that hasn't been changed at all. And in fact, it's been restricted through this bill. So another thing too, we've been talking about cost and affordability. There are hundreds and hundreds of hours of staff costs that went into and are still going into the city's analysis of inclusionary zoning and many other housing policies. And a lot of that work has just been erased with this bill. And I know our city planners are really scrambling to understand what do they focus on? Where do they go next? And, how do we react to this? How do we retool our processes and our own policies and bylaws to match this? And there's a huge cost to that as well within the municipality and every city across the province.
Jeff and then Sally, if you guys want to go ahead.
On the topic of rentals as well, the city was moving down a path in our official plan of developing a rental replacement regime, such that renters who were displaced by new developments would have options of finding alternative accommodation or accommodation within the new developments at rent similar to what they're already paying. And I think that's a feature of some jurisdictions, like for example, Toronto has a strong one. We were going down that path. Bill 23 and also the changes that the province have made to our official plan seem to have eliminated our city's ability to continue going down that path. Is that the case? And one of the whispers in the air is with respect to a province-wide standardization of what a rental replacement regime might look like. I don't know if anyone has heard any more details of what might be coming down the pipe with respect to that. So sort of two questions. One, does the bill mean what it says it means, which is we don't have an ability to do a rental replacement regime anymore? And is anything coming down the pipe to replace it from Queen's Park?
Awesome. I guess we can leave that question up, and also Sally, if you'd like to jump in with your hand before too. Or
So I would just like to add to this. Again, a lot of what we're seeing in Bill 23 appears to be driven towards an intensification of single dwelling, residential communities, but also greenfield. What we're not seeing is the opportunity in between. Like, those are the two extremes, I might say. There was a Building Better breakfast this morning. Sorry, I'm getting the term mixed up there. But in any event, it was focused on this huge amount of unused commercial assets that we have in our urban cores and elsewhere, resulting post-COVID from the evolution of the workplace. And it was examining how do we make use of these existing assets, which is the most cost-effective and environmentally effective way to intensify a community is potentially simply through the conversions of unused commercial space. And I don't see in Bill 23 that anything that facilitates that, makes that easier. It's very much a greenfields kind of focus and building new. So I just I don't buy the argument that we need to create, to buy conservation authority lands, that we need to, remove things from greenbelt designation, that we need to develop wetlands, that we need to dismantle wetland protection in Ontario to achieve more housing. Municipalities like Ottawa put plans in place and are actively working on achieving targets. And the opportunity is just growing with the evolution of the workplace and the deoccupation of all of these commercial spaces. We need to have life in our core. and that is the most logical way to, ensure that we have vibrant cities, that we capitalize on all of those assets that were built over the past 100 years in our urban centers to support communities. Rather than expanding and obligating ourselves and future generations to more costs. So I really question the assumptions and the approach that Bill 23 takes to addressing affordable housing in Ontario.
And I want to come back to the importance of things like rental replacement bylaws. And we've seen this in headlines. We've seen this in a lot of our neighborhoods where renters, particularly renters who are economically vulnerable, are being encouraged, coerced, even pushed out of their rental homes by people who know, the landlords who know that they can drastically increase those rents or redevelop the property and drastically increase the value of that property if they can just get those people out of their homes. And anyone who's been renting a home for 5, 10, 15 years ought to know that they cannot replace that rent anywhere in the private market right now. They're substantially higher. And I got to give a shout out. I don't know if Councillor Lane Johnson is on the call or not, the newly elected councillor in College Ward. She actually was one of the founders who got the Ottawa Community Land Trust Incorporated. And this is one of our purposes, is to be able to raise funds to purchase existing rental housing, preserve it as rental housing, but also to preserve those affordable market rents that are otherwise being lost. So I don't know if you're on the call, Lane, but thank you.
Lane is here. Hi, Lane. Thanks for joining.
Awesome. Thanks, Ray and Jeff and everyone for taking the time to answer. I'm just jumping to a question right now on some heritage conservation districts. So here we go. So does Bill 23 restrict the municipality's current ability to ensure that any infill after demolition of a non-contributing home in a heritage conservation district, an HCD, does not adversely impact the cultural heritage value of that HCD? David, perhaps this is best passed to you, but to everyone.
And David, if I may, a bunch of words in there are things that a lot of people may not necessarily understand. If you could give us some plain language context for that question, that would certainly be appreciated.
Well, one of the things we have in the city are heritage conservation districts, and these are portions of the city that over the years the municipality has designated under the Ontario Heritage Act to be of some heritage or historical significance. So when somebody applies for, does a development application or a zoning bylaw application, they have to go through another hurdle in a heritage conservation district, because they have to go to the Built Heritage Subcommittee and see how whatever they're planning for that particular property affects the heritage characteristics of the district. And I'll give you an example. In Rockcliffe Park, for example, the heritage attributes are open space, open green space, park-like atmosphere. So that if somebody wants to put a hotel there, then that wouldn't be acceptable. However, in Centertown and other places, if it would involve, if you're dealing with a vacant lot, for example, and they want to put a 35-story tower, that would not be in keeping with the profile of the district, and the Heritage Conservation District plan would probably check in, and they would initially be opposed to that. And that's where the trade-offs come. They say, okay, we're going to keep a heritage building or a heritage property, but we're going to build an addition onto it. And we're going to put an apartment building in the backyard if there's a large enough property. And you know, you work that out. You work it out with pre-consultations with the community. They go to the city's planning department, goes to heritage planning, and then it works its way through the Built Heritage Subcommittee. We've been fairly successful in the last few years of being able to have a lot of consultation with the communities. And a lot of this has been developer led, because they know that if they do a lot of pre-consultations, it's going to give them less grief once they go to city council or a planning committee, because they don't have 30 people lined up to speak against it. The aspects of Bill 23 that affect this are the whole business of by right, allowing certain developments. Before, what you would have is you were allowed a certain density, you were allowed to put an addition on a building. But now to say that, you know, you can put a triplex on any property means that that's not part of the consideration in looking at the effect on the heritage characteristics of the district. So it's one less hurdle for the developer to have to go over, but it's one more cause for concern by people who care about these heritage districts or individual heritage buildings. The other thing that probably a good time to comment on here is that in the past year, I looked up, you know, applications for development under the Ontario Heritage Act for site development and rezoning. And Built Heritage Subcommittee and subsequently Planning Committee in the city have approved 400 units of new housing. And that shows that, I think, that the Heritage Conservation District, or the heritage part of the consideration is not being a deterrent. The other thing, and I'll bring in here this Heritage Register business, which I think Councillor Leeper raised at the beginning. You know, the Heritage Register is not meant to automatically designate these buildings. In fact, it's just the opposite. Instead of designating the buildings, what you do is you say, here are potential properties that might be considered. And under the current regulations for the Heritage Register, an owner has 90 days in which to, before they can apply for a demolition permit, before they can demolish the building. And that 90 or 60 days, sorry, and that gives the city chance to look at that particular property in more depth and say, do we want to designate it or not? And, you know, I remember when this the register was established, one of the lawyers for a developer was telling me, oh, this is just going to be a tripwire for designation, that, you know, we're going to have all of these buildings and we're going to automatically designate them. In fact, you know, in the 6 years that the registry has existed, there have been 53 applications for demolition. And only in one occasion did the city say, no, you can't demolish it because we want to apply to have that designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. You know, if it is a tripwire to designation, it's a massive failure because it hasn't worked that way. Now, this business about the Heritage Register, and after 2 years, if you don't designate a building, it gets dropped from the register. What that's going to do is put more emphasis on the city to try to designate more people, more properties, because you know that, 2 years are coming up. We have to look at all these properties that were added 2 years before and see whether we want to designate them. And you don't have that that confidence that that building is going to be there. It's on the list, and if somebody wants to demolish it, you consider each case on its individual merits. So getting rid of the heritage registry, I think, is short-sighted. And it's going to do the exact opposite of what the provincial government are trying to achieve. I think they think heritage is a bit of a pain in the butt when it comes to development. And that's probably because they've been talking to too many developers. But so I think that's a big drawback with this, to get rid of those the heritage register. We worked long and hard in the city to have a register, and we've only had it for 5 or 6 years, and it's worked very, very well. And not to have this tool anymore, I think is going to be not a good thing for heritage preservation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David, for the rundown. I think there is some pretty huge heritage components that are great to understand in these cases. So we've been seeing a lot of questions as well on sort of the impact of Bill 23 on site plan control specifically, which we can get someone to explain as a term as well. So I've chosen one question to put to all the panelists. I heard that site plan control is changing under Bill 23. Could you please outline what those changes are and what the impact on the environmental and livable communities could be? So whoever wants to go.
So I'll start that one off. I will basically tell you that the main things that are changing is that a residential building that is going to have 10 units or less is no longer subject to site plan control. The City of Ottawa site plan control bylaw was recently changed to allow, I believe it was 6 units or less would be exempt from site plan control. So that's through the provinces basically being increased to 10 units or less. So that will notably change things because the city will no longer have the ability to oversee matters that they would typically look at through site plan control, which would be garbage and recycling and parking and driveways. There are still other zoning provisions that regulate those things that would be reviewed at the building code stage. There's a zoning plans examiner that reviews where garbage is located, how far it can be from a lot line, and the amount of parking spaces, where those parking spaces can go. So there's a lot of things that are already accounted for in the zoning provisions themselves, but anything 10 units and less will not be subject to site plan control. And then the other major thing is changing is that exterior design is no longer a matter of site plan control. So currently, the city has the ability to comment on materials, articulation, all that sort of design. And then in certain cases of the city, site plan control applications, the development is also required to go to the urban design review panel. And so that component of things is a little bit up in the air. I don't know if either Glenn or Jeff can comment on staff discussion about the urban design review panel relating to site plan applications and how that they think that might work. But since UDRP is typically looking at exterior design, it's unlikely that UDRP would then be required for applications that are going through site plan control. So those are the two main changes, and obviously how that would relate to the environment and other implications is that if you're not going through site plan control, you lose the ability to have a landscape plan reviewed and look at the amount of soft landscaping, and so those sort of things that they would typically review as part of site plan control. So I don't know if anyone else wants to sort of tack on to that, but those are the two main changes that we're seeing for site plan control.
I'm happy to jump in here just on sort of the more environmental elements of those. So I think I sort of alluded in my introductory comments that there's a lot of pushback on this. So one small change has been made to what Christine has termed as, no commenting on the external design. There's some exceptions in Bill 23. The ones that were existing sort of originally are anything that has to do with matters of health, safety, or accessibility, or the protection of adjoining lands. Those are things that were permanent comment on. The big significant change after the committee hearings, though, was the city can sort of comment on sustainable design, whatever that means. I have like, I think a lot of comments as I like on my version of this of like, what does this term mean? What is this like, what's attainable housing? What does sustainable design mean? So I think my interpretation of that based on just how it's been interpreted is you're dealing with, you know, green building standards, LEED certification, sort of that materiality aspect of it. Does it include something like landscaping, a landscape plan? You know, the city in their official plan has committed to, you know, 40% tree coverage. Is there an ability to say, I'm sorry, you have to add a tree to that sort of, and all those sort of green landscaping, green infrastructure elements? I would argue that's questionable. I think sustainable design is a little bit more narrow in its implication. The other thing I sort of noticed, and this was when I was like, you know, comparing the changes versus, you know, the actual, you know, existing wording of the Planning Act, is that sort of buried in section 16.1 of sort of the revised Bill 23 is there's a provision to add sort of, you know, if the municipality has passed a bylaw under section 97 sub 1 of the Municipal Act, which provides for green building standards and green roofs, one could consider that as part of the site plan review process. So that's sort of something that I see as a little bit of a scope for the city to ensure that they have passed a bylaw under that section under their Municipal Act powers, and B, to maybe make that as specific as possible. I'm not sure if that would be, you know, overridden by provincial action, but that might be a little bit of retained scope for the city to try and put a meaning to what one means by sustainable design. So I look at that as a little maybe diamond nugget of, you know, hope for the fact that perhaps there can be some sustainable design incorporated, just all of the work that the city did with respect to the official plan and those changes. There was, you know, a lot of a balancing, I think one can say, with, you know, there will be growth and intensification, yet that will be responsive, and, you know, there'll be site plan, and there'll be, you know, green space, and there'll be trees, and there'll be more trees. So I think a lot of Bill 23 erodes some of that ability for the city to have any ability to comment on that, but perhaps a little bit could be put in sort of through a municipal act bylaw.
Thanks. If I may just ask, and I want to ask Ray specifically, I mean, I think we've seen in the previous council and councils before, site plan has always been a process that is considered very technical. It's delegated to staff until I think it was Bill 109. However, City Council had the final say, and so the local ward councillor could refuse their concurrence for the exercise of staff's delegated authority. So staff had the ability to approve site plans unless the local councillor said, I want that voted on at planning committee. Going to planning committee with a site plan vote introduces complexity, it introduces costs. I think one of the things that the provincial government must be looking at is to depoliticize site plan as a way to fight zoning. Sometimes, frankly, we saw some councillors who would lift delegated authority in order to sort of take a second kick at the can on controversial proposals. But I'm just wondering, I mean, a lot of what the province has proposed here is intended to streamline the regulatory process in order to help get more housing built more quickly. Ray, you build houses, or you've been in roles in which you've built housing. To what extent are some of these rules more helpful maybe than a hindrance?
And I have to say, I should know better than to say anything that contradicts what Christy says, because she's way smarter than me. But I do think that some of these changes have the potential to reduce exposure to NIMBYism. And you know, do we need design control over every single size building? Do we need to have site plan control over smaller developments? When it opens up the possibility that someone, and I've seen this a lot of times, someone in a neighborhood doesn't want to see affordable housing in that neighborhood. So they find some design element, like a minor variance or a setback issue or something, that they can then appeal and build a campaign on. But that's not really what it's about. And that does block the creation of new housing. Look, all of us are going to have to get used to the idea that the city is going to intensify and the city is going to grow. It has to, because it can't continue sprawling. The financial and ecological costs of that are too great. That means that wherever your main street is in the neighborhood where you live, expect to see a taller building at that corner. Expect to see, you know, a little bit more density, maybe even on the block where you live. That's the only way their city is going to grow. And we can't keep giving everyone the tools to stop that kind of growth.
Back to this green standards bylaw, Christy, one of the big wins, I think, on our last council was we approved what's called high performance development standards. And essentially it was new rules that would require for new buildings a higher level of energy efficiency in order to reduce greenhouse gases and reduce the long-term cost of ownership, because it would cost less to heat and cool. Do you know if those high performance development standards, are they out the window still, or would this amendment that came on Monday, would this still permit Ottawa to enforce those standards?
I think I sort of see this nugget as sort of, you know, a tool for the municipality to ensure sustainable development and sustainable buildings, which I think is really essential. Like, I think it's important that when we're growing and building new homes, that they have the lowest carbon footprint. So my understanding is that I think those could be packaged to falling sort of within the city's jurisdiction under section like 97 sub 1, like, even if that's not how it was, I'd have to read the bylaw to see if that's exactly how it was laid out in its inception. I think that covers sort of the same kind of ground. It really, like, that section's about, you know, environmental green construction standards that are energy efficient and all of the things that that bylaw achieves. And I think, like, ostensibly that would be something that is sustainable design based. So I think that the city is sort of covered under sort of those two amendments that were made on Monday to this piece of legislation. So I think that's positive news in that, you know, the cost to retrofit a building so much more than just building it, you know, correctly the first time. And I think we know that, I mean, the two biggest inputs to greenhouse gases are there's the transportation sector, and then there's, you know, the housing sector. So I think that's sort of a way of sort of solving that side of the equation.
Well, I hope so, because that's kind of a huge component of our climate change master plan, is reducing emissions from buildings. And
exactly.
So yes,
exactly.
I hope it still counts. And again, it does add to the cost of building a home up front, but over the lifespan of a new home or new building, the operating costs are way less. So anyways, I'll stop there because I know we have lots of questions.
I agree.
Could I just add something to that? You know, from a heritage perspective, our mantra recently has been the greenest home or greenest building is one that's already there. And I think if we start from that premise, then we're looking at the kind of development that will give intensification, will contribute to the 15-minute community, and will be able to reach a lot of the aspirations of the official plan, at least what's left of it. So it just also ties in with heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for jumping in there. And just to add, as a comment we got from someone on the consultation process, just note that there's actually been an extension to comments on the bill until December 9th, save for the parts that are the changes to the Heritage Act and the Ontario Wetlands Evaluations. And just to note, we're actually at 89 questions in the chat, still at about 150 attendees. I've seen some comments about, you know, getting to questions and so on. I don't think we will be able to tackle the 89 in the next 20 minutes, but if you're wondering how many are kind of sitting right now, that's how many we are actually at, even if you've seen any marked. So we've been seeing a few on development charges, changes, and taxes. So I'm just going to pull out one of them that we've flagged. And if you'll just give me a moment, working as fast as possible. This is when we need the Jeopardy music, clearly. We did receive a question that said, if developer fees are lessened, does that mean the difference will be made up via increased property taxes? And maybe to sort of pair along with that, we also received a question that if you can describe the cuts to development charges more broadly, the impact on the city, and where the city will find replacement funding to support new growth, both sort of tying in. So I put that to everybody.
I could just give a number because this is coming from our city staff. They did a preliminary analysis and they said what's in Bill 23 would reduce development charge income by $26 million annually for the city of Ottawa. I think as a proportion, it's actually less than some of the municipalities like Toronto and the Toronto area because they charge significantly more. In fact, I think it was Oshawa, they were saying if they were to transfer their annual amount to their tax bill, it'll be like an 80% increase in the tax bill. But I think we should clarify the situation is not that dire in Ottawa. $26 million annually would not equate like an 80% or some, astronomical increase to the tax bill, but the money would have to be made up somewhere, either through finding revenue somewhere else through property taxes, or maybe an infusion from the province, who knows, or through a cut in services to make up the difference, because we cannot just absorb that without it having an impact somewhere else in our city budget.
Glenn, if I really quickly, I always like giving the figure because it helps people understand our budget a bit better. Every 1% increase in our taxes brings in about $17 million more revenue. That number is probably a little bit higher now, but so 17 million, in order to raise $17 million, we have to do a 1% tax increase.
Okay, so in very rough numbers, this could be 1.5% in very rough numbers.
And I also see Sally, your hand up if you'd like to go.
Yeah, so the legislation also provides for the freezing of fees charged by conservation authorities. And again, the trickle-down effect is if we freeze our fees, any revenue we can't achieve through fees is typically made up through our municipal levy. So again, the cost is downloaded to the municipality. So I don't know specifically whether or not when the city staff did their analyses, whether they considered the impact of the freeze of fees of conservation authorities, but it would also have an impact on all the municipalities within our watersheds.
So I don't want people to walk away from this with the assumption their taxes are going up next year to make up for this, because that is certainly not a decided, it's not a fact. One thing that I'm excuse me, waiting for from the province is last year they had this document that basically a think tank came up with, and it was a whole blueprint for how they called it improving affordability of homes, but essentially it was increasing the supply of homes. And all of these pieces of legislation that are coming through are implementing all of the suggestions from this task force. There's one that they haven't implemented yet, and it's a series of suggestions around somehow rewarding municipalities who are able to build more homes. And so that suggests to me that perhaps in the coming weeks, there may be some kind of a financial incentive regime coming from the province that would help municipalities make up for some of the cost implications of growth, whether it's through lost development charges that we're experiencing, or whether it's to help with our increased staff costs and study costs and implementation of new bylaws. So I think, or I will predict, we'll see some kind of announcement from the province within the next few weeks about some kind of a municipal grant or funding machine aimed at housing.
And Christine and Sally, again, if you guys would like to go.
Yeah, so I just wanted to tack on while we're talking about all the different structures changing in terms of fees that the city is able to collect on being development charges and parkland dedication. And obviously the city passed a parkland dedication bylaw relatively recently, which is then going to need to be further amended as a result of this bill. One of the other components that was adjusted, not with Bill 23, but with a previous bill, was application fees themselves, and that if they're not processed within a certain time frame, can be refunded to certain extents depending on how long an application has been progressing for. So, as an attempt to address, getting more homes and getting them faster, there's sort of multiple avenues that the province is taking to try and push getting more homes faster. And it's sort of, reducing fees and repercussions, I guess, if development approvals are taking too long. I think it was Bill 109 that brought that in, was the refunding of application fees. So that's something else that kind of also ties into this whole fee discussion for developments.
So I would just add, I wasn't aware, Glenn, of what you were talking about in terms of another program perhaps being announced by the province that might support municipalities in accommodating growth financially. I would just say that, that kind of model of rewarding a certain behavior has been tried in many sectors, and often it's associated with unintended consequences, because you're offering financial reward for a particular behavior, which may or may not result in the kind of decision-making that will result in sustainable development, and may obligate future taxpayers and generations to costs that they can't afford based upon a cash reward today. So I just flag that as something we need to be cognizant of.
Thank you, Sally. And Christine, I don't know if you have your hand still up, but if you'd like to go again. Awesome. Thank you both for the question. I'm just going to jump to one more question on heritage, if everyone would like to comment. David, if you'd like to comment, which just notes that there's been an increase to criteria for heritage designations with individual buildings and historic districts, and essentially that's going to narrow the number of homes and places that we can recognize and protect in favor of kind of more traditional communities. There's sort of just a broad ask on if anyone would like to comment on the impact of increasing that heritage criteria.
And by asking for 2 criteria now under the under Regulation 906 instead of just 1, it's limiting, I think, a lot of the changes in designations that have been happening over the past decade. Buildings were originally, conservation movement started, done mainly for their architectural merit. And so 90% of buildings were designated, or properties were designated, because they were of a particular type of architecture of a particular type of period. They also have an associative value, which concerned the people who lived in the building or used the building, whether it was a judge or a senator or a business person. And now what we're doing is looking at a very diverse community of that we should be looking at to celebrate and commemorate. And I think by cutting down by increasing the criteria, that we're limiting that new type of designation. We have a lot more ethnic groups in the city now than we did in 1974 when the Ontario Heritage Act was first proclaimed. We have a lot more research being done on these communities, a lot of oral histories being done, histories of particular communities and neighborhoods. And there are certain properties there that would lead themselves to designation. And by having to have that second criteria, then it would be perhaps limiting it. It might be a building that has no architectural value at all, but might have a very important social history or cultural value. And I think it's important, and that's one of the reasons that that regulation was written. So we could develop and spread the kind of commemorations by now. Maybe what we should be doing is looking at Regulation 906 and trying to rewrite it to make it more in line with the kinds of commemorations that we aspire to in the city of Ottawa. But right now, by just saying, okay, you need 2 criteria instead of just 1, it's, I think, going to be limiting our ability to designate properties at the very time that we want to widen the threshold. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, David, for that. And jumping to our next sort of 2 questions, we're combining a bit on sort of this legislation and its long-term goals. So all the recent initiatives from Queen's Park seem to be based on the idea that there's insufficient land available for housing. Has there been any study undertaken on residential development now authorized, but which is to be built? And sort of paired with that is if sort of thousands of units are being approved but not built, would it not be useful to point to Bill 23 failure to address this, sort of on the question of the goals of Bill 23 and sort of residential development in the long term, put to everybody generally?
I remember seeing something recently, actually, from CBC Ottawa. They had a number of homes and apartments that have been approved but not yet built. And I'm searching my email to see if I can see any reference to that. But there is analysis out there, and the city does an annual greenfield development report as well, showing how much land we have left and some estimates on how many homes that could be built in those locations. So I just don't have those numbers handy.
It was 4,000. 4,000 units have been approved but not built yet.
And I, if I may, I think, you know, one of the other considerations here, and sorry, I see some hands up, which is great, but there is a more aggressive population prediction for Ottawa coming from the province that is fueling, I think, some of their ambition with respect to approving more housing units.
So if I could just add, when any municipality in Ontario is looking to designate land for urban expansion, it is required to do the kind of analyses that is spoken to in this question. So every municipality has those kind of numbers. It knows what its capacity is for growth through infill, through greenfield, through repurposing of existing building stock. So it's not for lack of information. That information exists. The province can access it and could divulge that information to the public if it so chose. It has not done that. It has not provided the numbers to support the position it has taken that more land is needed. So I would encourage people to ask the province to provide that information, because ultimately official plans are signed off by the minister's office. That analysis is resident in the minister's office. His staff has that information and should be able to provide it.
The population projections, even from the last official plan exercise, probably would need to be updated anyway. I mean, we saw that the federal government is increasing immigration targets, as they should, and I hope we're able to welcome more people to Ottawa. Sprawl is not the answer. Density is definitely part of the answer. But look, the premise behind this bill, similar to the federal government's Housing Accelerator Fund, is this idea that Well, the only thing that's holding private development back is red tape and slow municipal approval processes. And you know, the city of Ottawa has approved more housing starts in the past couple of years than the decades behind that, and has kept up with that demand. But the economic circumstances trump any of that kind of stuff. You know, private market developers are taking their foot off the gas right now. We're seeing nationally and in large urban centers, housing starts, particularly multi-residential housing starts, starting to level off or even decline in a lot of places because the economic circumstances aren't right for people's business to do that. Those are far more important factors affecting supply than these regulatory kinds of things that governments seem to be focused on.
Thanks, Ray. I agree that the economic factor is a major one. But just working on the private side and speaking with developers every day, I know the other components are also extremely important and are a factor in terms of processing time, as well as the combination of all of the changes that have, you know, the development charges and the increase in parkland dedication that we've recently come in. And I know this is factored into their ability to make developments work to a certain extent. And you know, there's also the consideration of the construction situation right now has been an issue as well, and getting developments off the ground and getting a shovel in the ground. So there's a lot of components at play here, but I do think we have to address the things that we can address. And there's a lot of things that are outside of our control, interest rates, et cetera. That's something that, you know, the province can't necessarily deal with at the municipal level. But we can address processing time, and we can address, to some extent, reducing fees to make development more likely to happen. Whether all of those changes are the right answer right now, I don't know. I don't think we can have all the answers, but I do think changes are needed. And so I agree with that general direction. I don't necessarily agree with all components of Bill 23, but some changes are certainly needed to the way things are happening now, because we're seeing site plan control applications for, you know, small developments that are taking over a year. And that all of that time and the incurred costs on the side of things, extra consulting costs to go through it all. So there's those components as well. So I think we need a multi-pronged approach to deal with adding more units and adding more affordable units. And this is one part of that. It has its flaws, obviously. But there needs to be, you know, multiple answers to this problem.
If I could just pick up on the processing time issue and Bill 109. So the province is already tackling red tape in part through fairly heavy-handed legislative tool that is mandating turnaround times. And with the potential that municipalities, conservation authorities, others will have to return fees paid by developers or any applicant if those timelines aren't met. And part of the challenge that we're faced with is the employee shortage. You know, so we talk about the shortage of skilled trades. There is a shortage of planners in the province of Ontario. That is huge. It is very difficult to hire a land use planner in Ontario today. And these are some of those structural elements that this legislation and Bill 109 cannot address. And these are greater issues, and you do not help the situation by just simply opening up lands to development and not providing municipalities with the tools and resources they need to assess whether that's good development. And then I'm tweaking onto this other potential incentive-based financial reward for opening up those lands. So I'm just, the whole package gives me pause and a lot of concern. And I really think we need to take some sober second thought on this whole package as a province, as citizens, and ask the province to press the pause button and to say, demonstrate that more land is needed, demonstrate that the changes that you're proposing here are going to deliver affordable housing, demonstrate that you've exhausted your examination of other mechanisms to facilitate affordable housing in the province. And because I don't think they've done that.
David and Christy, do you have any thoughts on like that fundamental thesis and methodology?
Well, I do definitely. I'll try and be brief. I'm just referring to the city's own sort of comments on Bill 23 here. So I know that the city had noticed that there was a little bit of a disconnect, if you can put it that way, between sort of the housing target that was assigned by the province of, I believe it was 151,000 homes over the next 10 years, which was sort of 70% higher than what the Ministry of Finance had projected, and then double the city's projections in 2031. So we're talking a lot more houses. And I think where this is problematic, I mean, I think the general premise of needing to grow and needing to have affordable housing, I can't challenge that. I think that's definitely something that we need to work towards. But I think when we have sort of, you know, targets that are sort of that variable and that offset, it's perhaps creating this artificial push to expand our urban boundary. And I think we also have to understand this in like the context of, I mean, the city of Ottawa did some very detailed analysis about, you know, various options like the no growth option, the only intensifying within our urban boundary, modest sort of expansion of our urban boundary, and went with a modest expansion approach. But that was, of course, overwritten with a large expansion of the urban boundary. And then there is sort of within Bill 23, an ability for, once again, the ministry to amend official plans on a sort of, and introduce official plan amendments sort of on their own initiative as well. So I think like one of the comments that I kind of want to leave you with is the need for this bill is valid, but I think it's incentivizing the wrong types of homes and the wrong types of locations. I think like what Ray was saying, like, you know, we have to understand that, you know, where we have infrastructure and where we have services and where people want to live and where people can live efficiently and affordably, that makes some sense. But developing a greenfield that there's no transit to and our development charges are reduced, so one can't build more transit, one can't build a bike lane, one can't create a 15-minute neighborhood. It's unfortunately a lot of the good work that the city did in the official planning process doesn't really jive with this. It doesn't make sense. So I think I worry about targets that suggest we need to grow and grow and grow and expand and expand and expand. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Christy. And David, I see your hands up too, if you'd like to close us off on that question.
I just want to add one thing. There are lots of examples in the bill and in the amendments to the various other pieces of legislation that if for some reason the minister and whatever minister doesn't like what the municipality is doing, they can step in and override the decisions of the municipality. And I think that this is one of the fundamental problems with this kind of legislation. You know, I certainly have a lot of qualms about the type of things they're recommending for how they're going to build more housing, or how we're going to build housing. But you know, the fact that the province can, and I think they use, if it's something that has to do with transportation or safety or health, then the minister can overrule a decision of municipal government. And it sort of questions the attitude that this provincial government has towards municipal government. And I think that that's a fundamental problem with both the inherent way that this has been foisted on us, the dishonest way that it's been foisted on us. And, you know, Glenn alluded to that, you know, you proclaim the act or introduce the act the day after the election, which is, when the municipalities are most vulnerable to respond effectively to it. And also the actually details of what they're recommending. I haven't really heard anyone saying very much good about this piece of legislation, but then I don't talk to a lot of developers on a daily basis. But I really think that this is, these are the two things. And I think one of the things that all of us, whether we belong to NGOs or whether we're volunteers, can get behind the city in saying that this is just a power grab of this government to try to get control of various aspects of running municipalities that should be the purview of the municipal council. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So realizing we haven't gone to all the questions, we're just about up for our time tonight. So I think we're going to begin closing things out. Just wanted to say we noticed Councillor Curry is also attending the meeting right now. So thank you, Councillor Curry. Hello in the chat. And what we'd like to do to sort of finish off, knowing there's still a lot of open-ended and detailed questions to answer, is the final thoughts of each of our panelists that are here tonight on Bill 23 and what's happening. So I'm going to go in order, and actually I'll go in reverse order of what I see on my screen. Christy, if you'd like to maybe go first with final thoughts.
Sure, certainly. So I think, I mean, I still have sort of a lot of concerns about how this is going to affect sort of urban growth. And I'm going to sort of wear my twin hats of sort of environmental lawyer and land use planning lawyer, if I may. When I came to sort of this field, I was, a urban planning student of my master's, and I feel that a lot of the developments that we've made in, say, the last 20 years in terms of urban planning, in terms of, making sure that there were lessons from Walkerton, for example, the need for watershed planning when we're sort of planning our municipalities, the need to sort of look at things from like a holistic perspective, the need, to make planning decisions sort of through that lens. I think that this bill is eroding a lot of that ability, and I'm concerned with that. I think it's going to result in sort of sprawled communities. It's not going to intensify and sort of build up that missing middle housing, which I think is where there's sort of a sweet spot for efficient housing, sustainable housing, and affordable housing. And it's going to sort of be resulting in, a lot of single family homes far flung from sort of our urban centers. And that there isn't sort of consequently the same sort of infrastructure funds available with reduction in development charges to sort of pay for that. So I worry about how our urban fabric and how our services and how all of those things are going to erode. And I'm just afraid that the sort of the goals and the purpose of this legislation, which is building affordable housing faster, that is not going to be met, and we are going to have unaffordable housing that is just not sustainable either, and is sort of increasing our climate impact in adverse ways. So I'm a little buoyed by sort of the two changes that were made in terms of at least giving municipalities a voice on sort of that sustainable design. I do believe, and Glenn, I'm happy to do a little further analysis for you if you'd like, that sort of the performance standards that the city has worked on, can be built into this. But overall, I still have a lot of concerns.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christy. And Christine, if you'd like to go next.
Sure. So I think the objective of the bill as a whole, it makes sense that certain changes are needed, and I'm okay with certain changes of the bill. I think rushing it through and not allowing municipalities individually to assess what those impacts mean to them is a bit of a sore point for me. It is going to have massive implications, and I think there needs to be that time to review what those implications are, and how that would impact the municipality. I do think the push to intensify within the urban boundary, like Christy was saying, it's really reliant on those 3 units as of right, sort of on a lot sort of situation, and lessening the fees to hopefully incentivize development within the urban boundary as well. But increasing density through allowing three units as of right, like I was saying, you're banking on more landlords coming into play in the city. And a lot of what we've seen recently has, there's been situations of people who are going bankrupt or losing their homes because they're not getting paid rent because rent is high. But obviously certain landlords, especially in the situation of a single detached dwelling with a secondary dwelling unit, it's typically just a single homeowner who's renting out that unit, and they're banking on that rent. Like, they're not a massive landlord, they're just a single landlord. So if part of this bill is, to intensify through 3 units on a lot, like I said, you're kind of hoping that there's just going to be all of these landlords that are going to crop up, and not everyone wants to become a landlord because there's a ton of issues related to it. So, the intent of the bill makes sense, but there's some fundamental issues, and I think there's a lack of time to address what the overall implications are. So those are kind of my final thoughts. It's, there's no solid answers right now, but like Christy was saying, we're still kind of reviewing what's coming up and what the final one will look like. I'm sure Councillor Leeper and Councillor Gower will put out more details on when the final bill is given royal assent.
Thank you, Christine. And Sally, if you'd like to go next.
So I guess my final thoughts would be, wetlands is not where we want to develop. Wetlands provide critical functions to communities. They are natural habitats that make Canada a place we want to live. They're where people retreated to during the pandemic. It's our natural areas. To dismantle wetland protection in Ontario is exceedingly short-sighted. It puts all of us at risk. We all live downstream of wetlands here in Ottawa. And they are sponges that absorb surplus amounts of water during extreme wet weather events, and then slowly release it during extreme dry weather events. You don't get a better functioning system than that. So the province really needs to rethink its approach to deregulating and getting out of the wetland management business. We in Eastern Ontario have some of the remaining wetlands in Ontario. We've destroyed 80% of the wetlands in Southern Ontario. We in the East have much of what remains. We need to protect it. And in the Southwest, they're spending millions to rebuild that functionality back into their communities. So I think, if nothing else, I would say back off of wetlands, leave the regulation and the evaluation system where it is. And that would be my key message.
Thank you, Sally. And Ray, if you'd like to go.
Yes, similar to what Christina said, I think the starting premise of figuring out ways to increase housing supply and addressing the very real housing affordability crisis were good starting points. I think where this got lost in parts along the way was through a kind of a one-sided consultation in preparing the legislation. And I think we might be seeing that now that the legislation has been tabled. Glenn was talking at the opening about how the Association of Municipalities of Ontario was declined when they put in a request to consult on this. The city of Ottawa, the second biggest municipal area, was declined in a request to consult. Our mayor traveled to Toronto to meet with the premier, and the premier skipped it. So, I think that a more balanced review, there are community associations that welcome development and intensification. If those voices were at the table, I think that a better pathway could have been crafted that might have actually achieved the goals the government was setting out to.
Thanks, Ray. And David, if you'd like to go.
You're on mute, David.
Heritage preservation can and does play an important role in the housing and intensification goals of the city's official plan. And we are very supportive of developing these strategies. And I just wish the province would leave us alone to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Glenn and Jeff, if you'd like to finish this for tonight.
Well, I'll let Jeff have the final word, but to add to what everyone's saying, planning in Ontario isn't perfect, and no planning regime is, and there are issues within different policies and provincial laws that do hold up the development process. But in most cases here, we're just seeing the province do away with things entirely, and they haven't done it in consultation with cities. I know our city staff, our city planners, their submission to the province said, let's create some working groups with municipalities. We have people who are in planning every single day, thinking about this every day. I can't help but think if even this group of panelists put their heads together, they could probably come up with some really good ideas for the province to adopt. I know Mark Sutcliffe, our new mayor, was in Toronto this week. He did speak to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Steve Clark, and he said, please put a pause on this. Give us 30 days or 60 days and give us more time to review this and give you suggestions. And at the very least, let us sit down with you and talk about where we see this working and where we see this not working. And I hope the province will listen. There are going to be unintended consequences, and there are going to be things that have to be fixed out of this legislation, whether that's done this year or in 3 years or in 5 years or in the long term. There are going to be things to fix. But anyhow, appreciate all of the panelists, your feedback and your answers and all of the great questions. I just wish we could have gotten to more, but I think we'd be here all night if we got to all the questions. Jeff?
Thanks, Glenn. And yeah, I have a lot of concerns with the speed at which this is happening as well. We ask students to show their work, and in this case, the work isn't being shown. The fundamental assumptions that the province is making that ostensibly justify the measures that are being taken, these really blunt measures, are simply unknown to most of us who are going to be affected by them. Whether we're in the city planning department, whether we are in the housing sector, in the environmental NGO sector, whether we are people in our community associations just wondering what's going to be built next to us. There's no clear line from the policies that are being implemented to the assumptions and the methodologies and the theses that justify the measures that are being taken, and that's really disturbing to me. I'm really concerned about the loss of the growth pays for growth regime. It is potentially legitimate to say, yeah, taxpayers will pay for that infrastructure that we need. But for generations now, municipalities have not charged enough taxes to maintain the infrastructure we have in an effort to keep taxes low. And it's really difficult to imagine that municipal governments are going to take on a whole new tax burden to build new infrastructure in addition to maintaining that which we already have. So it's really concerning to me that the revenue source is being so fundamentally changed, particularly on the basis of assumptions that are opaque to everyone outside of Queen's Park. So I think we need more time to understand those assumptions and more time to grapple with their implications. I want to thank everyone who joined this evening. At one point, we were up over 160 participants. There's still 127 of you left. I did ask the panelists whether we could keep this going to answer the remaining 90 questions or so for the next 15 or 16 hours, but they've declined to stick around. We're well past time, and I do want to say thank you so much for giving us more time than we asked for. All of your insights were very gratefully accepted, or we are grateful for all the comments that you've made. So thank you so much to each of you. Christine?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention, the city of Ottawa usually puts up a website when they're doing secondary plans, and, you know, residents can reach out and there's a contact link or whatever. Something like this, which, you know, has really major implications, and, you know, everybody's kind of uncertain about what this means for the future of the city, and especially other changes. It might be helpful if the city had like a dedicated page that just generally allows residents to contact certain people about all of these questions related to Bill 23, or the changes from the province to the new official plan, sort of an area that, and I know they can reach out to their counselors, and that's fine too, but it might be helpful for the city to have a centralized location to deal with major provincial changes that have come up. Just a
Thanks. No,
suggestion.
a useful suggestion. We'll certainly take that back. For those of you who are wondering what to do about all this, the answer is fairly clear. Talk to your MPPs. This is very much a Queen's Park process. Let your MPP know what your concerns are, and hopefully they take those concerns with them when they go to committee to discuss this further and ultimately to vote. Ottawa, thank you very much. We will have this up on our respective web pages soon. Panelists, thank you again so much. Have a great evening.